They brought out the bread basket first, the way they always did at Luca's, on every anniversary for 11 years. I remember thinking the candle was crooked. That's the kind of thing your mind holds on to, right before everything breaks. I didn't see her come in. Daniel did. I watched his face change before I even turned around. A woman, maybe 7 months pregnant, hand pressed against the small of her back, walking straight toward our table like she'd been there before. She looked at him first. Not at me. At him. And she said, "Danny, I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. Everyone needs to know." I want to tell you I screamed, or stood up and walked out. I didn't. I just sat there, in the dress I'd bought to celebrate the man I'd put through business school with my own hands, and asked the only question that mattered. "No what?" Nobody answered me for what felt like a full minute. The candle kept burning, crooked, and somewhere in that silence, I understood my marriage was already over. I just hadn't been told yet. 11 years before that dinner, I married a man who used to write me notes on the bathroom mirror in dry erase marker so I'd see them while I brushed my teeth. Little things. "Have a good day, Claire." I made coffee. That was Daniel before the title in front of his name mattered more than the man underneath it. We met in our 20s, broke and ambitious in the way only 20-somethings can afford to be. I was teaching 10th grade English. He was 3 years into a sales job he hated, watching men 10 years older than him with MBAs walk past him for promotions he'd earned twice over. He used to say it out loud, almost like a prayer. "Someday I'm going to get that degree. Someday I'm going to stop watching other people get what I deserve." So when the acceptance letter came from the executive MBA program, I didn't think twice. I thought, this is the someday. This is the thing we've been waiting for. The program cost $78,000 over 2 years. We didn't have that. What we had was my mother's jewelry, which I sold piece by piece at a shop on 4th Street, telling myself she'd have wanted it spent on something that mattered. What we had was my summer break, which I filled with SAT tutoring sessions until 9 at night, 3 nights a week, for 2 summers straight. What we had was a home equity line of credit against a house we'd just finished paying down and a retirement account I cashed out early, eating the penalty, because Daniel said the program would pay for itself in 2 years once he graduated. I didn't resent any of it. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for what comes later. I believed in him. I believed in us. I drove him to the airport for his monthly residency weekends in Chicago with a thermos of coffee and a kiss goodbye, and I picked him up 2 days later, tired and lit up with new ideas, talking about discounted cash flow models and case studies like they were the most fascinating thing in the world. I loved watching him become someone. I just didn't know I was financing my own replacement. The first year, nothing changed except his vocabulary. The second year, something in his voice changed when he talked about the program. Less about the material, more about the people. One name in particular started showing up in his stories the way background noise becomes a melody if you hear it often enough. A classmate. "Sharp," he said. "Driven. She gets it the way you never could," he told me once, about some operations theory I'd asked him to explain. He didn't mean it as a knife. I don't think he even heard himself say it. But I heard it. And some quiet, practical part of me, the part that balances checkbooks and notices when milk goes bad a day early, made a note of it and set it aside. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't arrive. It accumulates. And you're the one who keeps the ledger, long before you admit you're keeping score. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from carrying somebody else's dream on top of your own job. And I want to describe it honestly instead of glamorizing it the way exhausted people sometimes do for sympathy. It was grading papers at 11 at night while he was on a video call about supply chain case studies. It was learning to make do with my 10-year-old car because the home equity payment came first. It was the small, specific loneliness of watching your husband's intellectual world expand in directions you weren't invited into, not because he excluded you, but because you were too busy keeping the actual machinery of the house running to climb in beside him. By the 18th month of the program, I had a list. I didn't call it a list. I called it noticing. Women do that. We call surveillance noticing, so we don't have to admit we're already building a case. Daniel started showering before bed instead of after work, which he'd never done in 11 years of marriage. He started taking his phone into the bathroom. He started saying study group the way other men say business trip, a phrase so smooth it had clearly been practiced. And there was a smell, sometimes, when he came home from a residency weekend. Not perfume exactly, something cleaner, like a hotel soap that wasn't ours. I told myself it was paranoia. I told myself a lot of things. I told myself that grad school made people weird, made them absorbed in their own transformation, and that I was being small for resenting a man who was finally becoming the version of himself he'd always wanted to be. I told myself I was tired. I was teaching full days and grading papers at night, and somewhere in there I'd stopped being a wife and started being infrastructure, the thing that kept the lights on while he built something shinier. The name came up again at dinner one night in March. Vanessa. He mentioned she'd helped him rebuild a financial model the night before a presentation, stayed up with him until 2 in the morning on a video call. She's basically my study partner at this point, he said, laughing, reaching for the salt. I remember exactly what I did. I passed him the salt. I asked if the presentation went well. I did not ask a single question about Vanessa, because some animal part of me understood that the moment I asked, I would have to hear the answer, and I wasn't ready. A week later, I found a flight confirmation in his email, open on the shared family laptop he sometimes forgot to log out of. A residency weekend in Chicago, fine, expected. But the return flight was a day later than the program calendar said it should be. One extra night. Unaccounted for. I didn't say anything. I want you to understand what that silence cost me. I went to work the next day and taught my students about foreshadowing in The Great Gatsby, about how Fitzgerald drops small details early that the reader doesn't understand until the end. And I stood in front of 30 16-year-olds explaining a literary device I was currently living inside of, and none of them knew. And I almost laughed, and I almost cried, and I did neither, because that's what 20 years of being a responsible adult teaches you to do with your face. That night, I started a folder. Not on our shared computer. On a flash drive I bought with cash. I didn't have a plan yet. I just knew I needed somewhere to put what I was starting to see. I think back now to a weekend in February, right around when the soap smell started, when I'd planned a small trip for the two of us. Just one night at a bed and breakfast 2 hours from home, a tradition we used to keep before the program ate every spare weekend we had. Daniel canceled it 3 days before. Capstone deadline moved up, he said. I'd already arranged my sub coverage at school for nothing. I sat in that empty room by myself for one night, because the deposit was non-refundable, and I told myself a marriage survives seasons like this. I didn't know yet that I wasn't in a season. I was in an ending, dressed up as a busy semester. Once you start looking, you don't stop. That's the part nobody warns you about. I'd always thought of myself as a trusting person, the kind of wife who didn't check phones or ask for passwords. I was proud of that, actually, in the quiet way you're proud of things you've never had to test. Trust is easy when nothing's pulling on it. I went through the credit card statements first, because that felt less like spying and more like budgeting, which is the lie you tell yourself when you're already 3 steps past where you said you'd stop. 3 hotel charges over 4 months that didn't match the program's official residency calendar. A 4-star hotel in Cincinnati on a weekend he told me was a solo study retreat for his capstone project. A restaurant charge for 2, a steak place, $80-some. The same weekend, time-stamped 8:47 p.m., while I was home grading essays and believing he was alone with a laptop and a thermos of black coffee. I told myself there could be other classmates there. Study groups. Cohorts traveled together sometimes. I knew that. I wanted so badly for there to be an innocent explanation that I built 3 or 4 of them myself, fully formed, before I'd even finished the next sentence of looking. Then I found the contact. Saved in the shared family iCloud account we'd set up years ago for photo backups. Of all places, a habit from when we shared everything by default, before either of us understood that some doors should stay separate. Vanessa R., study group. The contact read, with a small notation under it, the kind you make so you remember who someone is months later. Met at Chicago residency. Finance concentration. Funny. Funny. He'd written down that she was funny. I called my closest friend, Monica, not because I was ready to say the word out loud, but because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Monica had been at a conference in Chicago herself, 8 months earlier, for her own job, and she got quiet on the phone in a way that told me everything before she said a word. Claire, she said slowly. I saw Daniel at a coffee place near the Loop. He was with a woman. They were sitting close. I didn't think anything of it. I figured it was a work thing, but now that you're asking, that was the moment the floor became the ceiling. Everything I'd built my life on top of was suddenly something I was standing under, looking up at, wondering how long it had been hollow. I didn't confront him that night. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strength. It was fear, dressed up as patience. If I said it out loud, it would become real in a way I couldn't take back. So instead, I kept the folder. I kept noticing. And I started, very quietly, looking for a lawyer. There was a smaller lie buried in all of this that hurt in its own particular way. Daniel had told me, weeks earlier, that the program assigned cohort accountability partners for the capstone project, randomly paired by the administration, and that his partner happened to be Vanessa. I called the program office myself on a Tuesday during my lunch break, using the calm, administrative voice I usually save for talking to parents about a failing grade. The woman on the phone, kind enough not to ask why I wanted to know, confirmed there was no such system. Students chose their own study groups. Daniel had chosen her. Twice, in 2 consecutive semesters, when rotation was encouraged. That detail, small and bureaucratic as it was, told me more than any hotel receipt had. He hadn't been swept into something. He'd selected it, on purpose, semester after semester. The lawyer's office smelled like coffee and air conditioning, and the woman behind the desk, Patricia, had the calm of someone who had heard every version of my story already, which somehow made it both worse and easier. Worse, because it meant I wasn't special. Easier, because it meant I would survive it, the way all the women before me apparently had. Before we talk about options, she said, I want you to understand something. Right now, you have suspicion. If this goes anywhere, divorce, separation, even just a conversation where you want the truth and not his version of it, suspicion won't help you. Documentation will. So I became someone I didn't recognize for a few weeks. Methodical. Quiet. I started keeping a written timeline, dates and receipts, screenshots saved to a separate email account Daniel didn't know existed. I wasn't trying to win anything yet. I was trying to know, fully and finally, what I was actually standing inside of, instead of guessing at its shape in the dark. The full timeline, once I laid it out on paper, took my breath away in a way the individual pieces never had. The Chicago residency where they'd met was 14 months before the anniversary dinner. The first questionable hotel charge appeared 2 months after that. By month 6, there were messages, not full conversations. Daniel was more careful than that, but enough fragments synced accidentally to an old shared tablet that weren't about case studies anymore. One read, I keep telling myself this is just stress relief. I don't know what it is anymore. Another, sent at 11:52 p.m. on a Tuesday, I remembered clearly because I'd fallen asleep waiting for him to finish a study call. I can't keep doing this to her. But I also can't stop. He knew. The whole time, some part of him knew exactly what he was doing to me. And he kept doing it anyway. And somewhere in his head, he must have built a version of himself who was suffering too, who deserved sympathy for the difficulty of betraying me slowly instead of all at once. I found Vanessa's photo through the program's online cohort directory, a page meant for networking, headshots, and one-line bios under a university logo. She was younger than me by maybe 6 or 7 years. Finance concentration, the bio said, formerly at a regional bank, passionate about mentorship and financial literacy for women. I read that line 4 times. I thought about the financial literacy I'd practiced for 2 years selling my mother's rings to pay for the degree that put my husband in the same room as her. I didn't hate her yet. That came later, in smaller, more useless doses. What I felt that day was something colder. Recognition. The particular vertigo of realizing the story you've been told and the story that's actually been happening are 2 completely different books, and you've only ever been holding one of them. I looked at her social media too, the way you tell yourself you won't and then do anyway, alone, at midnight, scrolling backward through a stranger's life like an archaeologist digging for the exact week everything changed. There was a photo from a conference dinner, 14 people around a long table, Daniel 3 seats down from her, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I recognized his shirt. I'd ironed it. There was another, months later, just the 2 of them, captioned "Study breaks are underrated." A coffee shop I didn't recognize, her hand resting near his on the table, not touching, but close enough that the distance itself looked deliberate, the kind of almost touching that's really just touching in code. People ask, later, why I didn't say anything sooner. Why I sat across from him at breakfast for nearly 2 more months, passing the syrup, asking about his thesis defense, while a flash drive in my sock drawer held enough evidence to end everything. I've had a long time to think about the honest answer, and it isn't flattering. I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting the last few weeks of a life I knew was already gone. The way you sometimes sit in a parked car outside your own house for an extra minute before you go in and face what's waiting for you. There was also this. I wanted to see how far he'd let it go. Some part of me, the part that used to diagram sentences for a living, needed to know the ending before I could grieve the story. Was this a man drowning in something he regretted, who would eventually come to me broken and honest? Or was this a man who had already, quietly, started building his next life out of the wreckage of mine? I got my answer 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner. I was going through his suit jacket before sending it to the dry cleaner, an ordinary Tuesday chore I'd done 1,000 times without thinking, and a folded paper fell out of the inner pocket. An ultrasound printout, black and white, the curve of a small spine, a date stamped in the corner. 22 weeks. I sat down on the closet floor and did the math twice, because I needed to be wrong, and I wasn't. 22 weeks before that Tuesday placed conception right around the time of his solo capstone retreat in Cincinnati. The hotel charge. The steak dinner for two at 8:47 p.m. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that, almost clinically curious about my own reaction, the way you'd watch a science experiment that wasn't behaving the way the textbook predicted. I felt, instead, a strange and terrible clarity. He hadn't told me. He'd known for months that he was going to be a father with another woman, and he'd let me keep paying the final loan installment on his degree. He'd let me start planning our anniversary dinner at Lucas, the place we'd gone every year since our wedding, the place where 11 years earlier he'd stood up at the end of the meal and told the whole restaurant he'd married the only person who ever believed he could become something. I put the ultrasound back exactly where I found it. I sent the jacket to the dry cleaner. And I made a decision that I still don't fully understand the bravery or the foolishness of. I would not confront him before the dinner. I would let him sit across from me at that table, in that restaurant, on the anniversary of the day he promised me forever, and I would watch what he chose to do with the truth he was carrying. I didn't know yet that the truth would walk in on its own, 7 months pregnant, in a blue dress, and save me the trouble of asking. In the 3 weeks between finding that ultrasound and the night of the dinner, I did something I'm not proud of and not ashamed of either, which is its own strange place to stand. I made copies of everything. The flash drive, duplicated twice, one left with Monica, one in my desk at school, in case anything happened to the original. I opened a separate checking account and moved a portion of my paycheck into it for 3 pay periods, quietly, the way you'd store water before a storm you haven't announced out loud yet. I bought the dress for the anniversary dinner anyway, a deep green one Daniel had once said he liked, and I remember standing in the fitting room thinking, with a kind of dark clarity, that I might be buying the dress I'd wear to the end of my marriage, and some defiant part of me wanted to look beautiful for it regardless. I need to take you back into that restaurant, because the version I gave you at the start was only the first 10 seconds. There's more, and the more matters. After Vanessa said what she said, Daniel didn't stand up. That's the detail I keep returning to, even now. He didn't rush to her, didn't rush to me. Didn't do any of the things a man does in movies when his two lives collide in a dimly lit Italian restaurant with breadsticks going cold on the table. He just sat there, one hand still resting near his wine glass, and said her name, quietly, like a man caught not in an affair, but in a math error he'd been hoping nobody would audit. Vanessa, he said. Not here. Please. Not this isn't what it looks like. Not Claire, let me explain. Just please, not here. The request of a man more concerned with the venue of his exposure than the fact of it. She put a hand on her belly, instinctively, the way pregnant women do, a gesture that's usually so tender it breaks your heart. And in that moment it broke mine for an entirely different reason. I'm due in October, she said, and I understood she wasn't talking to me. She was talking to him, finishing a conversation they must have had a dozen times in private. The kind where he kept saying soon and she kept saying when. Tonight, apparently, had been her answer to when. The restaurant had gone the particular kind of quiet that happens when 20 strangers all decide at once to listen without looking like they're listening. I could hear the kitchen door swinging. I could hear ice settling in somebody's glass 2 tables over. I could hear, absurdly, the same old song that had played at our wedding, drifting out of a speaker in the ceiling like the universe had a cruel sense of musical timing. I looked at the candle between us. Still crooked. I'd been right about that, at least. How long, I said. Not a question with a question mark. A statement aimed at the air between the three of us, because I already knew the number, 14 months, and I think some small, vicious part of me wanted to hear if he'd tell me the truth or hand me a smaller, more comfortable lie. He chose the lie. A few months, he said. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to. 14 months, I said. Since the Chicago residency. Since you told me you were rooming with two guys from your cohort to save money. I watched something behind his eyes recalibrate. The specific look of a man realizing the wife he'd underestimated had been keeping better records than he had. Vanessa, to her credit, didn't deny it. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. He told me you two were already separated in every way that mattered, she said. That you were just finishing out the lease on the marriage until his graduation for financial reasons. Finishing out the lease. I'd financed his entire degree, refinanced our home, sold my mother's wedding ring, and what he'd told the mother of his child was that I was a lease he was waiting to let expire. I stood up. I didn't throw anything. I didn't say anything else clever or devastating, because I didn't have anything left that felt like mine to give either of them. I picked up my purse, told the waiter, with what I can only describe as eerie politeness, that we'd need the check split two ways, and I walked out of Luca's into a parking lot that still smelled like somebody else's cigarette, and I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I trusted my hands enough to drive. Daniel came home around midnight. I know because I was sitting at the kitchen table when his key turned in the lock, the same table where I used to grade essays while he was supposedly studying alone 3 states away. I hadn't moved much in 3 hours. I made a cup of tea I never drank. I'd looked, more than once, at the framed photo from our wedding that sat on the side table, the one where he's mid-laugh, and I'm looking at him like he was the safest decision I'd ever made. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking that morning. That's a strange thing about catastrophic nights. The people in them start shrinking in real time, as the version of them you'd built up over a decade collapses into something more accurate and less impressive. Say it, I told him. All of it. Tonight. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to tell the truth one time in this marriage before it's officially over. So he did. In pieces, the way men do when they've finally run out of room to maneuver. It started at the Chicago residency 14 months ago, exactly as I'd calculated. A study session that ran late. A drink afterward that wasn't on the program's calendar. She made me feel like the guy I used to want to be, he said, and I remember thinking, with a strange detachment, that I had spent 11 years married to the guy he used to want to be, back when that guy couldn't afford rent without my paycheck covering the difference. Apparently, that version of himself only became attractive again once a 28-year-old with a finance concentration discovered him fully assembled, debt-funded, and grateful. The pregnancy, he admitted, he'd known about for 5 months. He'd been planning, he said, to figure out the right time to tell me. After graduation, after his expected promotion, after the new job offer in Chicago came through, the one his MBA had made possible, the one that would let him relocate to the same city where Vanessa lived, the city I had financed his access to with a home equity loan we were still paying off. I want you to sit with that the way I had to. I sold pieces of my mother to put him through a program that built him a bridge directly to another woman's city, and I was going to be the one still living in the house we mortgaged to build it. You let me plan our anniversary, I said. You let me pick the restaurant. You let me believe, for one more dinner, that we were still something worth celebrating. I didn't know how to tell you, he said. I was scared. You weren't scared, I told him, surprised at how steady my voice was. You were comfortable. Scared people tell the truth badly and immediately because they can't stand carrying it. You carried this for 14 months without flinching. That's not fear. That's a man who liked having 2 lives more than he disliked lying about it. He didn't argue. I think, by that point, even he could hear how thin his excuses had become. I told him to pack a bag. Not forever, I said, not yet, because some old habit of fairness in me still wanted to hand him a process instead of a verdict. But that night, in our house, in our bed, was no longer a place either of us got to pretend belonged to both of us. He left a little after 1 in the morning. I remember standing at the window watching his taillights go down the street, the same street I used to wave him off from for residency weekends, thermos of coffee in hand, sending him off to become someone, never once imagining I was watching the early footage of my own ending. The weeks after are the part nobody puts in the movie version of Betrayal because they're not cinematic. They're paperwork. They're sitting across from Patricia again, this time with the flash drive instead of just suspicion, going through 11 years of joint finances line by line, trying to figure out what was actually mine after I'd spent so long calling everything ours. Here is the part that surprised me most. The law, in its practical and slightly cold way, considered Daniel's MBA a marital asset, something I'd financially contributed to and could, in theory, fight for a share of, a portion of his increased future earning potential, calculated and divided like a pension. Patricia laid out the math for me. It was significant. It was also, I realized somewhere in that meeting, not actually what I wanted. I didn't want a percentage of a degree I'd paid for with my mother's jewelry and 2 summers of tutoring exhausted teenagers until 9 at night. I didn't want to be tied to Daniel's income, his career, his new job in his new city with his new family, for years of court-mandated payments that would require lawyers and calendars and a relationship with him I had no interest in maintaining. I wanted out, clean, even if clean cost me money that I had, in every real sense, already earned twice over. Patricia asked me once, near the end of one of our meetings, why I was so certain. I told her about the dress still hanging in a garment bag in my closet, the green one, never worn again, and how I'd realized that the woman who bought it to look beautiful for an ending didn't need Daniel's money to feel like she'd survived something. She just needed to stop checking the rearview mirror for him. My sister thought I was insane. My mother, if she'd still been alive to sell me her own advice along with her jewelry, probably would have told me to take every dollar the law allowed. My father just kept saying, "Take him for everything, Claire." Every time we spoke, like it was the only sentence he had left in him. I understood where all of it came from. I just didn't feel it. What I felt was simpler and, in its own way, more expensive. I wanted my name on nothing that still had his name on it. If you've made it this far with me, you already know this isn't really a story about a man and an MBA and a woman in a blue dress. It's a story about the version of yourself you almost lose track of while you're busy financing somebody else's becoming. I think a lot of you watching this are somewhere in your own version of that math right now, trying to calculate what's fair, what's owed, what you're allowed to walk away from without guilt. I want to be honest with you the way I had to be honest with myself in that lawyer's office. And if you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day, because these are the conversations I think we don't have enough of out loud. The hardest decision wasn't actually the money. Patricia handled the money. That part just required signatures and patience. The hardest decision came on a Tuesday night, alone in the house for the first time since he'd left, standing in the kitchen where I used to grade papers, looking at the photo of us from the wedding still sitting on the side table, and asking myself a question I'd avoided for 14 months. Not what did he take from me, but who was I going to choose to become, now that I finally had the room to decide? I took the photo off the side table that Tuesday night. I didn't throw it away. I'm not interested in pretending 11 years didn't happen, and pretending isn't the same thing as healing. I put it in a drawer instead, the way you put away a coat for a season you're not in anymore. I check it sometimes, not out of longing, but the way you check a wound to see if it's finally closed. The divorce finalized 7 months later, around the same time I heard, through people who still talk to people, that Vanessa had the baby. A boy. I don't know his name, and I've made peace with that. He's not my story to carry, and neither, anymore, is his father. I didn't take a settlement tied to Daniel's new income. I took the house, sold it within the year, and used what was left to do something I'd shelved for 11 years without admitting I'd shelved it. I enrolled in a graduate program of my own, literature, the thing I taught but never finished studying myself, back when I was 24 and convinced there'd always be time later. Later, it turns out, doesn't arrive on its own. You have to go get it. I'm not going to tell you I don't think about the math sometimes, what I paid for, what I lost, what it would have looked like if I'd never sold my mother's rings for a degree that ended up funding someone else's relocation. I think the version of this where I tell you I have no regrets would be a lie, and I promised you the truth in that kitchen, so I'll keep promising it here. What I will tell you is that the woman sitting in that classroom now, finishing the degree she put off for a man, recognizes herself in the mirror in a way she hadn't in years. That's not nothing. Some nights, it's everything. I don't know what brought you to this story tonight. Maybe you're living some version of it right now, doing the quiet math in a kitchen of your own, wondering if what you're noticing is real or if you're imagining it. I won't tell you what to do with that. I'll only tell you what I learned the hard way. The noticing is never wrong. It's just early. If this found you at the right time, stay with us. Follow the channel, and if you know someone sitting in their own version of that restaurant booth right now, send this to them. 5 people, even, if you can think of 5. Tell me honestly in the comments where you'd have walked out or where you'd have stayed, because I read every one of them. And tell me what story you want me to tell next. I'm still here. I'm still listening. And for the first time in a long time, I'm telling my own story instead of financing somebody else's.